Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another response video to Pogan, also known as the New American Left. In recent weeks, I have decided to turn Pogan into a little pet project of mine, since he's trying to game the algorithm with his low-effort, works-cited free video essays in pursuit of that left anti-tanky clout. Thus, I shall respond in kind by making multiple video responses to him. That way, whenever somebody searches his name, or whenever YouTube recommends his content, over there in the recommended tab, the algorithm will too recommend my videos, exposing his incredulous anti-communist nonsense for what it is. And what nonsense do I speak of today? Well, Pogan has decided to call the Soviet Union imperialist. Somehow.
Designed to show that the Cold War was, in fact, a multipolar global struggle between two imperialist powers.
Okay, so before we continue, I'm going to provide Vladimir Lenin's definition of imperialism and explain why I, as an anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist, believe that this is the one and true definition of the term. Imperialism is what can best be described as capitalism at the stage of monopoly. It is when the financial oligarchy has reached the hard limits of capital and wealth accumulation within its own domestic borders, so then it proceeds to go on to draw and corner foreign markets, typically in less developed countries. It's the reason why whenever the IMF and World Bank shackle a country with debt, one of the first things that they do is move into liberalize. That is, enclosure onto the commons, privatization of state assets and public services, the laxing of trade regulations, and the opening up of domestic markets for transnational corporations to compete. In Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he gives a proper point-by-point classification of this phenomenon. Number 1. The concentration of production and capital has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. Number 2, the merging of bank capital with industrial capital, and the creation, on the basis of this finance capital, of a financial oligarchy. Number 3, the export of capital, as distinguished from the export of commodities, acquires exceptional importance. Number 4, the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which share the world amongst themselves. And number 5, the territorial division of the world among the biggest capitalist powers is completed. Imperialism is capitalism at that stage of developments at which the dominance of monopolies and finance capital is established, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun, in which the division of all territories of the globe among the biggest capitalist powers has been completed. This is the definition of imperialism. It is not when big country do something to small country, nor is it when the world's sole socialist superpower makes active efforts to spread revolution. And the reason why this definition is important, and why we Marxist-Leninists go solely by this definition and not by others, is because it is a concise scientific classification of the term based on Marxian analysis of political economy and observable patterns in the real world. It is also because this is the definition given by Vladimir Lenin, and if this is the metric by which you are going to judge whether or not a country is imperialist, then you should use the Marxian definition of the term. However, if you're going to invent your own definition of the term or use a different definition of the term, then you should state so at the onset. Otherwise, to assert the Soviet Union is imperialist according to the actual political economic definition is false. The Soviet Union had no financial oligarchy. There was no finance capital. They did not export capital with the intent of private enrichment back at home. There were no monopolies in the capitalist sense of the term, and they did not territorially divide the world amongst themselves. Imperialism is a uniquely capitalist phenomenon, and since the Soviets were not capitalist, they, by extension, did not have the capacity to exercise economic imperialism. But Pogan doesn't use our definition. Instead, he removes the context of capitalism and uses a definition that he can try to apply to the USSR.
What imperialism is exactly. Imperialism, generally, is the policy of extending the rule of a given state over other states, and peoples, through a combination of hard power and soft power. Hard power refers to overt and aggressive political actions, such as invasions, while soft power refers to the use of bribes, deals, and other acts of diplomacy or trade to encourage another state to enter a great power's sphere of influence.
That's right. Pogan has redefined the term so that he can spin a narrative that the USSR was an imperialist power. There is so much wrong with this that I don't even know where to begin, but I guess I'll start by posing a few questions. What is a communist superpower to do in a world full of imperialist powers that want it dead? Not try to spread socialism wherever and whenever they can? What if not intervening in a country's national liberation struggle means handing it over to the forces of reaction? Wouldn't communist occupants to circumvent such a thing be a preferable alternative? You do realize both Marx and Engels were internationalists and they believed communism to be a global phenomenon, right? What he's doing here is making an argument from emotion from which he may base his infantile critiques of Soviet foreign policy. If all you have to do is redefine words so that your arguments make sense, then effectively what you are doing is the equivalent of starting from a desired conclusion and then working backwards via selectively filtering data to support said conclusion, or as Mao called it, cutting the toes to fit the shoes. Not only is this unscientific, as one is supposed to start from the data and then work their way towards the conclusion, it is also intellectually dishonest, and can only serve, consciously or not, to manipulate the viewer into believing a narrative. Essentially, it's the classic Burger psychology of, I know you are, but what am I? If the Soviets are imperialist, then our true socialist doesn't need to be a dialectical materialist. They don't actually have to know or understand the history of communist regimes. Instead, they can simply take the moral high ground, sit on the fence post, and proceed to signal virtue about how both sides are bad, and I'm not one of those evil tankies, I'm one of the good ones. I'm a pure socialist. But alas, let us humor him. Let's hear what our pure socialist friend has to say.
There are many conceptions of imperialism, but the one we are utilizing here simply refers to a state power attempting to expand its sphere of influence, or its territory, through the use of either hard or soft power, as we mentioned previously.
The problem here is that he has effectively redefined imperialism to mean whenever one country tries to influence another country. Israel and Saudi Arabia both donate to US senators as to influence our politics. Does this mean America is being imperialized by the Israelis and the Saudis? What kind of frail socialism is Pogan trying to advocate in which the socialist bloc countries don't try to spread socialism because it might offend the moral sensibilities of radlibs on the internet 50 years later?
The two main understandings of imperialism in competition here are 1. A more liberal comprehension, aka the one we've just defined, and 2. The Marxist conception, which was later expanded upon by Lenin, which understands imperialism as an extension of capitalist societies exporting the influence of capital to other regions.
Pause. Why the hell do we care about liberal misconceptions of the term? I thought we were supposed to be Marxists.
However, the latter is a self-fulfilling prophecy, since it essentially states that there can only be imperialism under capitalism, which begs the question against someone who understands imperialism to be the more ideologically neutral conception.
Pause again. Liberals did not invent the term imperialism. Lenin did as to explain and critique a unique global economic phenomenon which emerged during the era of capitalism. It is true that there have been empires in the past, but the term imperialism itself was coined by Lenin to mean a specific stage of capitalist development. And it's not question-begging when you provide a scientific definition of something based off conclusions drawn from observable reality. It is in fact Pogan and the radlibs whom have co-opted and redefined the term into apparently meaning whenever one country influences or controls another that are the ones engaging in circular reasoning here. Next up, Pogan presents his fourth grader liberal arts tier definition of imperialism in the form of political influence, economic exploitation, and cultural domination. Let's glance over some of his arguments, shall we?
Empires have two main properties: a metropole, that is a center, and a periphery. The key function of an empire is that the metropole exploits the periphery, often economically, in order to further the agenda of the metropole, or simply accumulate greater amounts of capital or resources. Let's first discuss what sort of cultural norms and values the Soviet Union advocated for other regions to adopt. The chief propaganda effort of the Soviet Union, at least socially, was to prop up the concept of the, quote, new Soviet man, end quote, an individual who possessed selflessness, physical fitness, enthusiasm about spreading the socialist revolution, and adherence to the doctrine of Marxism-Leninism. The latter two qualities are most important here, as they specifically call for one to follow Marxism-Leninism, the state ideology of the Soviet Union, and to spread that ideology as much as possible.
Oh no, you can't just try to influence the culture as to inspire people to be progressive, hardworking, disciplined, and devoted to a cause greater than themselves. That's bad. Marxism, Leninism, bad. Oh, boo-hoo, boo-hoo.
It's important to understand that, to those who wished to spread Marxism-Leninism, this was perceived as anti-imperialist, since it necessarily entailed the overthrow of capitalist states. However, as we know from previous videos, the implementation of Marxism-Leninism as an ideology only led to authoritarianism and repression. We are therefore not inclined to, for lack of a better phrase, take the Soviets' word for it that their intention of spreading an authoritarian statist ideology was somehow non-imperialistic.
You provide no Workcited in any of your video essays to support your claims, and yet you expect us to just take your word at face value. Your critiques of Marxism-Leninism are shallow and infantile, and they read like a Wikipedia article. What you call an authoritarian state is what can better be described as a dictatorship of the proletariat engaging in a protracted struggle against global imperialism, and most examples of so-called authoritarianism that I've heard anarchists and left liberals bring to the forefront are things that were not unique to the Soviet system and were largely a byproduct of the time in a culture that was deeply conservative. From the ban on abortions to the criminalization of homosexuality to penal labor, none of these things are unique to the USSR and have existed in capitalist countries both contemporarily and to this day.
A union of socialist republics that, at least nominally, were independent and had the capacity to function in an autonomous manner. At the center of the Soviet Union was Russia, the hub of the Union. Though these republics were autonomous on paper, they were required to fall in line with general orders and governance issued by Moscow, under threat of intervention by Soviet armed forces.
Yep, just gotta protect the global revolution and circumvent capitalist restoration as well as fascist color revolutions. Do you people now see why we don't use Pogan's definition? We are communists. We want to spread communism. And yet, if we were to go by his definition of imperialism, literally any and all necessary action that needs to be taken on an international stage to protect and spread socialism can be defined as such and therefore morally bad and therefore not worth pursuing. Capitalists are always trying to spread and impose capitalism. So why shouldn't we do the same?
Eventually, the Soviets created the Warsaw Pact, a complement to the Western organization NATO, which was intended to prevent Western powers from using any state in Eastern Europe as a base of operations. This also enforced the Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that a threat to socialist rule in any member state of the USSR was a threat to the entire Union.
Truth, because NATO was originally formed as an anti-communist organization to act as the bulwark against the Soviets. With Operation Paperclip and projects of the like, the West welcomed many former Nazi officers, politicians, and intelligentsia with open arms as to have them integrated into their respective countries. At the same time, both at home and across the world, the Western colonial bloc worked around the clock endlessly to circumvent the spread of socialism, from the Red Scare to Operation Mockingbird to Operation Condor and so on. America has been the world's #1 exporter of fascism since the 50s. Apparently Pogan prefers the latter, however, since US-backed fascist dictatorships are evidently preferable to communist regimes in his eyes. Then again, this is coming from the guy who thinks that North Koreans deserve to starve and that Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese were evil Stalinist totalitarians and not freedom fighters trying to take their country back.
The Brezhnev Doctrine was employed to justify the Soviet-led occupation of Czechoslovakia and put down the reform government that was forming in that region. This resulted in two things. First, it prevented any member of the Soviet Union from meaningfully breaking with the strict doctrine of Russia. Second, it left the definitions of socialism and capitalism exclusively in the hands of the Kremlin, meaning that any deviation in government could be said to be an attempted capitalist reform, and thus serve as justification for the use of force.
At last, a historical example we can talk about. Earlier, Pogan effectively defined imperialism as when one country is trying to dominate or influence another country for political and/or economic gain. But does the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia count as such? How did the Soviets stand to benefit, either politically or economically, from intervening in Czechoslovakian politics? And how did it come at the expense of the Czechs? Let's do a little investigation, shall we? Throughout the 1960s, Czechoslovakia was dealing with a great deal of economic turbulence, unemployment, as well as stagnation brought on by the revisionist and liberal economic policies imposed by the managerial class. Wages were frozen for industrial workers, while pay for managers and enterprise directors steadily rose throughout the 60s. Protections against unemployment were sparse, and the trade unions had minimal say in opposition to the managerial elites. Political pressure for increased workplace democracy and worker self-management was widespread, but the general elitist atmosphere was against such decisions since they felt as though it undermined the long-term economic pursuits of the country, as well as cutting into the managerial stratum's power. By the late 1960s, striking, protesting, and slowdowns were widespread across the country in opposition to the lack of democracy and the managerial elites encroaching liberalization, which were wrecking the economy and hurting the workers' living standards. At the same time, some of the political elites in the governments were starting to cozy up with NATO and West Germany. Out of concern for what was going on, the Soviets sent a cease and desist letter to the Czech government. Quote, "The development of events in your country causes us deep apprehension. The offensive by the reaction supported by imperialism against your party and the foundations of the social regime in the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic threatens, we are deeply convinced, to push your country away from the socialist path, and consequently threatens the interests of the whole socialist system. Anti-socialist and revisionist forces have taken the press, radio, and television into their own hands and have transformed them into a tribune for the attacks on the Communist Party, for the disorientation of the working class and all working people, for an unbridled anti-socialist demagoguery, and for undermining friendly relations between the USSR and other socialist countries. In this atmosphere, attacks are being carried out against the socialist foreign policy of the USSR and against alliance and friendship with the socialist countries. One hears voices which demand the re-examination of our joint and agreed policy towards the Federal Republic of Germany, regardless of the fact that the West, German governments follow without change a policy hostile to the interests of the security of our countries. Attempts by the governments of the FRG and the revisionists to engage in a flirtation find echoes in the leading circles of your country. The leading circles of the FRG display particular activity. They intend to make use of the events in Czechoslovakia in order to plant the seeds of disagreements among the socialist countries, to isolate the DDR, and to carry out their revisionist plans. Do you not see that the counter-revolution deprives you of one position after another, and that the party is losing control over the course of events and is retreating more and more under the pressure of anti-communist forces? It is our conviction that a situation has been created where the threat to the socialist foundations of Czechoslovakia menaces the common vital interests of the remaining socialist countries. The people of our countries would never forgive us for indifference and carelessness in the face of that danger. Our parties and peoples bear the historic responsibility for not allowing the loss of the revolutionary gains already obtained. This is why we consider that a resolute rebuff to the anti-communist forces and a resolute struggle for the preservation of the socialist regime in Czechoslovakia are not only your task, but also our task. Needless to say, due to increasing domestic tension, the corruption, political uncertainty, and the unrelenting pressure from below to overturn liberal policy, the Soviets, along with 4 of their Warsaw allies, proceeded to invoke the Brezhnev Doctrine and invade the country and reverse the course of liberalization. While the Czechoslovakian working class were not exactly fond of this intervention, it did work in the sense that it undid the liberal economic reforms, circumvented the tide of reaction stemming from the managerial elites, as well as various liberal interests in the country, and restored political and economic reform that was in general more favorable to the working class. I just want to finish this segment by saying that the Soviets gained nothing politically or economically from doing this. Outside of making sure that the revolution wasn't betrayed from above, they gained no economic advantage over the Czechs after the invasion. Relations merely resumed back to normal for both countries. This is not imperialism, even by Pogan's liberal definition of the term. Moving on.
One of the most significant incidents showcasing Soviet imperialism was the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, in which Soviet forces crushed an anti-Soviet revolution in the country. Political purges were carried out in which victims of the purges were characterized as Titoists, referring to Yugoslavia under Joseph Tito, Trotskyists, or Western agents. Hungary attempted to separate itself from the influences of both the US and the USSR, proclaiming itself a democratic socialist state. This revolution was destroyed by Soviet forces and Hungary was reassimilated into the Soviet Union.
Okay, so the Hungarian Revolution warrants a video in and of itself, but for now I will just give a brief summary of what happened. From the years 1920 to 25, Hungary was a fascist theocracy ruled by the Horthy dictatorship, allied with Nazi Germany prior and during World War II. Under the Horthy dictatorship, the church, allied with the aristocracy, controlled virtually all of the land and all of the wealth. Income inequality was among the most extreme in Europe, and routine purges were undertaken to crush any and all political dissent. Fast forward to 1944-1945. The Soviets overthrow the Horthy dictatorship and establish a new communist government. Tragically, however, the destruction from the war had reduced most of the country's infrastructure to rubble. Word has it that not a single bridge was left standing by the end of that war. One of the most prominent figures in the new communist government was Matyas Rákóczi, a man who partook in the attempted socialist revolution in Hungary in the year 1919 and had spent 16 years as a prisoner under Horthy. The remnants of the old Communist Party of Hungary are what ended up constituting the new government. The new government brought forth land reform, in which they seized and redistributed some 8 million acres of private land and estates back to the peasantry. The Hungarian bourgeoisie would go on to be displaced. Industry would be nationalized and socialized, and the construction of socialism had begun. Massive strides were made in the expansion of human services, as well as child caring and the educational system. Within an ex-fascist regime that was effectively a system for and by the ruling class, the displaced bourgeoisie and landlords are not going to take kindly to losing all of their wealth and power. And on top of that, such a nation which endured over a generation of fascist theocracy, preceding dozens of generations of feudal aristocratic economic relations, will be culturally impacted as such, and stamped with the birthmarks of their old ways. These fascist undercurrents didn't just disappear a decade later during the student protests of 1956. The protests would go on to be quickly co-opted by reactionaries, and all of a sudden, the call for democratic reform and greater political autonomy for Hungary had been transmuted into a call for the outright overthrow of the new communist government. In other words, it had become a color revolution. What did the Soviets have to gain from their intervention in Hungary? The short answer is the thwarting of a potential counter-revolution. One could argue that Khrushchev's response was rather harsh, sure. But the last thing the Soviets and the Warsaw needed was an island of reaction deep in the heart of the socialist camp. The Soviets did not imperialize Warsaw or the rest of the countries in which they intervened, not even by the liberal definition of the term. They sold commodities to the Warsaw below market prices and purchased their commodities above market prices. This is not imperialism. This can't even be called economic exploitation. This is what is known as subsidizing. They were subsidizing the Warsaw Pact, as well as the development of socialism across the world, which is the opposite of economic exploitation, since the unequal exchange is going in the opposite direction.
Another example is the Soviet-Afghan War of 1979 to 1989, in which Afghani communists attempted to overthrow their government, committing mass political executions in the process, and Soviet forces invaded to support their efforts. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was justified through, you guessed it, the Brezhnev Doctrine.
Apparently, Pogan would have preferred the control of Afghanistan to go to the old tribal warlords and mujahideen. Or at the very least, those are the kinds of implications that can be drawn from his moralistic rhetoric about Soviet foreign policy. For those of you who are interested in the history, I shall link Michael Parenti's article on the Soviet-Afghan conflict below, so that you may check that out at your leisure. But for now, I shall save my final thoughts for when he is finished.
We also need to understand that the Soviet Union, for obvious reasons, aided and assisted various other communist or anti-US organizations in their revolutions. A brief list of those revolutions they assisted, either through strategic aid, monetary aid, military aid, or all three, is as follows. China from 1944 to 1949, Iran from 1945 to 1946, Indochina from 1946 to 1954, including Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, Paraguay in 1947, Malayan communists from 1948 to 1960, North Korea from 1950 to 1953, the Mau Mau rebels in Kenya from 1952 to 1960, Indochina again from 1953 to 1975, it was mostly Vietnam this time, and so on and so forth. Basically, any time there was a communist revolution somewhere in the world while the Soviet Union existed, regardless of the exact intentions of that communist revolution, the Soviets supported it.
Bro, are you listening to yourself? Are you seriously going to sit here as a self-proclaimed leftist and moralize about the evils of the Soviets trying to spread communism and sponsor national liberation movements as though it were a bad thing? Need I remind you once again that both Marx and Engels, men you supposedly uphold, were internationalists? For the last 2 centuries, the imperialists have been cramming liberal capitalism down everyone's throats globally. The CIA has overthrown 50 democratically elected leaders across Latin America in the last century alone. They have backed the anti-communist mass killings all across Latin America. They backed an anti-communist genocide in Indonesia during the 1960s. And then they destabilized the Middle East in pursuit of the transnational bourgeoisie's super profits during the 90s and 2000s. Before World War II, it was the Soviets alone that consistently took a principled stance against fascism, while the liberal powers simply backed and enabled it by doing business with the Nazis and pursuing their policies of appeasement. When Franco's fascist forces moved in to crush the CNT-FIA, it was the Soviets alone that lent them arms and armaments and support, while the British and the French took a blind eye. When the Nazis went on to occupy and invade Austria as well as Czechoslovakia, it was the Soviets alone whom offered to do a joint strike against the Nazis. And once again, the liberal powers would only continue to ignore it. No, it wasn't until the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese began to threaten British and French colonies down in Africa as well as Southeast Asia that they finally decided to get involved in the war. And even then, during World War II, it was the Soviets that suffered the majority of the casualties and did the majority of the fighting against the Nazis on the Eastern Front. Having a socialist superpower which actively aids the Third World in their national liberation struggles against colonialism, as well as the construction of socialism globally, as well as acting as a bulwark against the Western colonial bloc and the Great Satan are absolutely net positive things. And the loss of the Soviet Union and global remission of communism has actively set us back as a species roughly half a century. And for Pogan to sit here and preach about the evils of Soviet imperialism and the moral impudence of their actions, as though what they were doing is somehow equally as wrong as what America and the Western colonial world were doing and have done, is to say that workers don't have the right to defend themselves effectively. It's like saying though slavery is wrong, it is equally as wrong for the slave to kill his master and liberate himself. Therefore, the slave should just remain a slave. It's like saying, though it is wrong for the French to occupy and colonize Korea and Vietnam, utilizing slave labor, raping their women, and plundering their natural resources, it is equally wrong for the Koreans and the Vietnamese to rise up and stand up for themselves. And it is equally as wrong for the Soviets to step in and aid the Koreans and the Vietnamese in their national liberation struggles. Time for some final thoughts. I'm going to be speaking directly to you, Pogan. When you attack these countries and make the points that you do, calling them immoral and imperialist, and deny the provable facts that they were socialist, and follow up with the points that to fight for liberation, or to aid in the fight for liberation, you are being violent, and therefore morally wrong, you are effectively arguing that we should just sit by and let evil triumph. We should just sit idly by while they exploit us, keep us divided, send our brothers and sisters to kill in their names and die in their adventurous wars, and wreck our planet with their unsustainable industrial activities. You think that you know better than us and the people who did revolution just because you adopt this nice, safe, comfortable, liberal, moral high ground position by saying that both sides are bad, therefore we shouldn't support socialism since it's not true socialism, and that true socialism, the socialism that only exists in your head, the socialism that can't be stress tested against the pressures of the real world, is the only true socialism worth supporting. You claim to be the true leftist, and yet here you are, carrying water for the imperialist narrative that both sides are bad, therefore when revolutionary movements do rise up to the occasion, they are not worth supporting because they don't fit within your perfect moralistic box of what a revolution ought to be. So in the end, while the bourgeoisie fights and wins the class war, while our planet continues to be wrecked beyond repair, the only thing afforded to you, Pogan, is that you stay true to your rigid pacifism and moral principles through and through. You are a coward to the bitter end. People like you make me sick, and you are part of the reason why the left is failing. Anyways, for the rest of the video, he continues to moralize about the evils of Soviet intervention and assisting in popular uprisings on the grounds that trying to spread socialism is imperialist and therefore equally as bad as when the United States backs fascist coups, even though time and time again, the outcomes for workers is demonstrably worse when America has things its way 10 times out of 10. And I'll go ahead and leave it at that. Shout out to my Patreons. Your gratuity is greatly appreciated. I apologize in advance for the lack of chaos under heaven this week. Episode 26 will be airing this Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Anyways, that's all I have to say about that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will see you guys next time.